Imagine stepping into the heart of ancient Rome, where marble corridors gleam under the flickering light of oil lamps, and whispered conversations between women echo through the lavish villas. The air is thick with the scent of rose oil and incense, but there's something else, something darker that lingers, something so alien to our modern world that it seems like it's pulled from fever dreams. This is a world where intimacy, sexuality, and power intertwine in ways we can hardly fathom today. In Rome, the concept of love and relationships was not what we know now. Social and sexual norms were rigidly controlled, where personal desires were secondary to political power and social standing. Roman marriage, for example, wasn't built on love, but on strategic alliances between families, designed to protect wealth and secure political favor. The wedding night? For many couples, it was the first time they met privately. The pressure to consummate wasn't romantic, it was transactional, and the consequences of failure were significant. Behind closed doors, women like Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, navigated complex power dynamics, maintaining the delicate balance between public virtue and private manipulation. Her ability to gather political intelligence through intimate relationships reveals just how much personal power could be hidden within the most private spaces of Roman life. But it wasn't just about politics. It was also about control, of not just who could have sex, but who could own the body of another. For the wealthy, slaves weren't just property. They were instruments of pleasure, grooming, and even power. This wasn't a society built on love. It was built on control. In ancient Rome, the concept of sexual freedom was deeply entwined with power dynamics, and none exemplified this more clearly than the institution of slavery. Slavery was not just an economic system in Rome. It was woven into the very fabric of Roman intimacy and sexual life. Household slaves, who made up a significant portion of the population, were seen not only as workers, but as possessions to be used however their masters wished, often for sexual pleasure. This lack of agency for slaves shaped not just their lives, but the very nature of Roman relationships. Wealthy Roman families would keep slaves specifically for their beauty, or for their abilities to entertain, and to serve in highly intimate roles within the household. These slaves were sometimes trained in the arts of seduction, and they became both the property and the pleasure tools of their masters, existing without any legal protection or personal consent. These intimate roles were not hidden, rather, they were integrated into the social life of the elite. Wealthy men often kept multiple concubines, many of whom were also slaves, and used them as both symbols of their wealth and tools for their pleasure. This created a system where the divide between the human and the property became blurred, as sexual service was expected from those seen as subjugated to the will of their masters. But it wasn't just about physical control. The power dynamics within Roman households created an atmosphere where sexual exploitation was not only accepted but expected. Women, too, were bound by the sexual expectations of their societal roles. A Roman woman was not free to explore her own desires. Her sexuality was tied to the family's honor. This wasn't just true in the private sphere. Public bathhouses in Rome, which were among the most famous of Roman social institutions, were centers where the lines between sexual encounters and regular daily activities became almost non-existent. These bathhouses were designed to facilitate social interaction, but also served as venues for sexual activities. Men and women bathed in separate areas, yet the proximity often led to flirtation and sexual arrangements. In fact, many of the attendants in these bathhouses were sexual workers, available for various forms of intimate interactions. The casualness with which sex was integrated into everyday life is difficult to comprehend in modern terms, but in Roman society, it was considered natural, something so normalized that it often took place without the need for discussion or discretion. But this social normalization didn't stop at just slaves and bathhouses. Roman citizens, too, engaged in intimate acts that reflected the deep social hierarchies within the empire. Men of higher social standing, particularly wealthy and politically connected men, had a significant amount of leeway when it came to their sexual behaviors. They could engage with slaves, prostitutes, and even foreigners without societal reproach. But there was one crucial rule. The act of being penetrated was forbidden. The idea of a Roman man being passive in sexual encounters was an affront to his social standing. Power was displayed through dominance, sexual and otherwise, and any behavior that threatened this dominance was seen as a threat to Roman authority itself. This concept extended even into relationships with other men. Homosexuality was not taboo in Rome, but there were strict rules that governed how these relationships were supposed to unfold. A Roman man could have a sexual relationship with another man as long as he maintained the dominant role. To be penetrated by another man, however, was seen as a severe loss of honor, a stain on the individual's reputation that could undermine his political standing. This was exemplified by Julius Caesar, who was rumored to have had a relationship with King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia. Though the accusations were never fully confirmed, they were enough to fuel political gossip and harm Caesar's public image. The very idea of sexual domination and submission was not just a personal matter, but a reflection of the power structures that governed Roman society. This notion of dominance also shaped how Roman families were structured. Marriage, particularly among the elite, was often an arrangement of convenience and power. The idea of love in marriage was secondary to alliances that would bolster the political or financial standing of the families involved. The wedding night for many couples was a business transaction, often the first private moment they spent together, with the weight of expectation to consummate immediately. It wasn't about love, but about producing legitimate heirs who would carry on the family legacy and, in many cases, increase the family's power and wealth. But even within this system, love occasionally did find a place. However, it often came with limitations. The emotional relationships that did exist, often hidden away from public view, were a reflection of the emotional complexities of the Roman psyche. Yet, even within these relationships, there was a shadow of power, as emotional attachment in the Roman world could easily be overshadowed by societal expectations, particularly for women. Women were expected to maintain their sexual purity and dignity within marriage, but the idea of their romantic desires being freely expressed was far from the reality. Roman women were often manipulated by their families. Married to men they may not have known, their role in society often relegated to being the bearer of children and the keeper of family honor. The obsession with women's sexual purity was reflected in the creation of marriage contracts, many of which included clauses specifying sexual expectations. For example, a Roman marriage contract from the 1st century AD might include a provision that the wife must submit to her husband's sexual demands no fewer than twice a week, unless she was ill or undergoing religious purification. If she failed to comply, there were financial penalties, an indication of how deeply sexual relations were intertwined with wealth and power. This transactional nature of intimacy, especially among the elite, continued to shape not just Roman marriage, but also how intimate relationships were perceived in society. It wasn't just about love or companionship. It was about control, status, and power. The more control one had over the bodies of others, whether through slavery or marriage, the more power they wielded in Roman society. Even in death, this complex web of control over intimacy continued. Tombs and funerary practices often featured imagery that celebrated the continuity of sexual relationships beyond the grave, with many tombs decorated with erotic frescoes or scenes that suggested that intimacy could extend into the afterlife. The sexual customs of ancient Rome were not merely eccentricities of a bygone era. They were foundational to the way the Romans understood themselves and their place in the world. Power, pleasure, and intimacy were forever linked in ways that still resonate today, reminding us that our own understanding of sexuality has always been shaped by the forces of power, status, and control. As we continue to unravel the bizarre and complex sexual practices of ancient Rome, it becomes clear that Roman sexuality was not confined to the private or personal realm. It was deeply interwoven with public life, social status, and the very structure of Roman society. The Romans had a unique way of blending the personal with the political, and this is nowhere more evident than in their public spaces. The famous Roman bathhouses, while widely recognized as places for hygiene and relaxation, were also crucial social hubs where sex was not just a possibility, but an expected part of daily life. These bathhouses were where men could unwind, socialize, and even indulge in sexual encounters with slaves or prostitutes. For many, the bathhouses were the epicenter of their social lives, and sexual transactions were a fundamental part of this social exchange. Men and women were typically kept in separate bathing areas, but this segregation didn't prevent the blending of their worlds. The social mixing that took place just outside these segregated spaces allowed men and women of different social classes and backgrounds to come together in a more informal and unregulated way than in other public spaces. Sex workers, many of whom were slaves, were present in these bathhouses, offering their services openly. In these spaces, sexual activity was often a casual and public affair, with no stigma attached to it, at least for the men engaging in it. But while public bathhouses and sexual activities were integrated into the Roman daily routine, they were also regulated by strict cultural norms. The behavior expected of men and women in these settings was directly tied to their social status. For men, engaging in sex with slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners was entirely permissible and even expected. However, any man found in the passive role during sexual activity was subjected to severe shame. This concept of dominance and submission, when it came to sexual encounters, reflected broader Roman attitudes about gender, power, and social hierarchy. A Roman citizen's status was defined, in part, by the sexual roles he played. If a man allowed himself to be penetrated, it was not only a personal defeat, but also a public disgrace. Roman men were expected to maintain the dominant, active role, and this was closely tied to their masculine identity and social standing. Conversely, women were expected to remain chaste and demure in their sexual roles, but when it came to pleasure, there was a contradiction in the way they were treated. Roman women, especially those in the upper classes, had their sexuality controlled not only by their families, but by the state. Women were not encouraged to express sexual desire or pleasure openly. They were expected to remain passive, dutiful wives, who were only to engage sexually for reproduction. Any deviation from this ideal was considered not just morally wrong, but socially and legally dangerous. A wife's sexual purity was directly linked to her husband's honor and political power. Marriages were often arranged to consolidate wealth, secure political alliances, and produce legitimate heirs. If love developed between a couple, it was considered a fortunate bonus. The marriage bed, on the other hand, was a battleground for power struggles, as Roman women were often subject to the will of their husbands and the laws of Roman society. At the same time, Roman women were also required to perform their sexual duties on command, often detailed in their marriage contracts. These contracts stipulated how often a wife was to satisfy her husband's desires. If a wife refused or failed to meet these expectations, she could face penalties, including financial punishments or even divorce, which could lead to social ostracism and financial ruin. But for men, fulfilling these desires was expected, and there was little to no societal consequence for them. The idea of a Roman woman's obedience was further solidified through the role of religious and societal pressures. Women were often forced to align their sexual behavior with religious expectations, particularly those related to fertility and family. The matronly ideal was tightly bound to the notion of sexual restraint, and public honor depended on the adherence to these rigid standards. The Roman legal system was instrumental in perpetuating this control. Laws around sexual behavior were numerous, and their enforcement was meant to preserve social structures. Marriage contracts frequently included sexual clauses, often detailing how many times per week sexual intercourse was expected, underlining the transactional nature of Roman intimacy. For a Roman woman, sexual independence wasn't just discouraged, it was potentially punishable. The complexities of Roman sexuality were evident even in their public festivals, which, although celebrated as religious occasions, often contained elements that modern audiences would find shocking. Take the Floralia Festival, for example. Celebrated in honor of the goddess Flora, the festival included public performances of sexual acts, often featuring naked dancers and explicit representations of sexual acts. These events were seen as integral to fertility rituals, believed to encourage agricultural abundance. Although respectable Roman women typically avoided such events, prostitutes, slaves, and freed women eagerly participated. What made these festivals particularly revealing about Roman society was the hypocrisy that permeated their culture. While Roman elites decried such acts in their personal lives, they would often attend such festivals, indulging in the very acts they condemned. The intersection of public and private sexuality in Roman culture often led to double standards. Roman men, for example, could indulge in sexual pleasures with slaves, prostitutes, and foreigners without consequence. Yet the sexual purity of women was fiercely protected. This duality became one of the most defining features of Roman sexual culture. While men could exploit the bodies of those considered inferior, women's bodies were viewed as essential for upholding the honor and reputation of their families. This gendered view of sexuality was not limited to the aristocracy. It permeated all levels of Roman society. Even among the slaves, sexual exploitation was a regular part of life. Slaves were often used as tools to demonstrate wealth and power. Wealthy Romans kept slaves who were trained in various forms of intimate service. These slaves were often tasked with ensuring their master's sexual pleasure, including grooming, entertainment, and sometimes even sexual relationships. As strange as it may seem, these relationships were a stark reminder of the power imbalance that existed not just between men and women, but between Romans and those they enslaved. Roman sexual practices were rooted in a deeply entrenched hierarchy where both gender and social class determined sexual roles. Roman marriage, as an institution, served not only to secure social and political alliances, but also to ensure that sexual behavior remained within the confines of social expectations. The pressure to conform to these expectations was immense, and any deviation from them could result in serious social consequences. Sexual behavior was more than just a private matter in Roman society. It was a reflection of one's status, power, and place in the world. This intricate web of rules, expectations, and double standards highlights the complexity of Roman sexuality and reveals how deeply power, politics, and social structures were embedded in every aspect of their intimate lives. The way the Romans viewed sexuality was rooted in their need to control every aspect of society, including the most private of moments. It was a world where sexual behavior was not just personal but political, where intimacy was a reflection of power, and where the boundaries between the public and private spheres were often blurred beyond recognition. As we come to the final part of this journey, through the bizarre sexual practices of ancient Rome, it's impossible to ignore the enduring legacy that Roman sexuality has left on modern society. From the most intimate moments of Roman citizens to the very structures that supported these behaviors, we find echoes of Rome's approach to sexuality, power, and social order lingering in the present day. Although much has changed since the fall of the Roman Empire, the social hierarchies that defined Roman intimate life have left an indelible mark on the world. One of the most striking legacies of Roman sexuality is the way in which it shaped attitudes toward power and dominance in human relationships. The Romans created a system where sex was not just a personal act, but a public demonstration of social standing. Roman men, particularly those of the elite class, were expected to maintain dominance in all aspects of life, including their sexual relationships. To be penetrated, to take the passive role in a sexual encounter, was a public disgrace, a loss of honor that could damage a man's reputation irreparably. This concept of dominance and submission, tied so tightly to masculinity, is still evident in modern societies, although often in more subtle forms. Whether through the lingering cultural expectations of traditional gender roles or the way power dynamics are expressed in relationships today, the remnants of Roman notions of dominance continue to shape our views on gender, sexuality, and control. This legacy can also be seen in the ways that sexual relationships are often still subject to social approval or disapproval, particularly when they challenge established norms. The Romans were obsessed with control, not just of their public image, but of their private lives as well. Their strict codes of behavior surrounding sex were meant to protect the social order, ensuring that wealth and power remained in the hands of the few, while the many were kept in check. This desire to control human relationships, particularly sexual ones, remains a force in modern politics and society. In many cultures today, there are still systems in place designed to control or regulate sexual behavior, whether through laws, cultural expectations, or social taboos. The Roman practice of arranging marriages for political and financial gain is also something that has persisted into modern times, albeit in more subtle forms. While love marriages are now more common in many parts of the world, arranged unions, especially among the elite, continue to be used to consolidate wealth, power, and influence. In some cultures, family expectations still play a significant role in the choice of marriage partner, and the pressure to maintain family honor and status remains as strong as it was in ancient Rome. The Roman approach to sexuality was also inextricably tied to the concept of control over reproduction. Roman women, particularly those in the upper classes, were expected to maintain their chastity and sexuality as a reflection of their family's honor. Any deviation from these standards, whether through adultery or sexual desire that didn't align with their husband's wishes, was met with harsh consequences. Modern societies, too, continue to regulate female sexuality in various ways, often through laws, social expectations, and cultural norms. Although women in many parts of the world now have greater autonomy over their bodies and sexual choices, the societal pressure to conform to certain standards of behavior, particularly when it comes to sexual conduct, remains. In the Roman world, marriage was not just about love. It was about producing legitimate heirs to carry on the family name and maintain the family status. The pressure to perform sexually in marriage was immense, and failure to meet these expectations was met with social censure. While the specific pressures of Roman marriage may no longer apply in the same way, the expectation to maintain sexual fidelity and meet certain standards within marriage still exists in many societies. The contractual nature of Roman marriage, with its explicit clauses about sexual obligations, may seem foreign, but it reflects the broader cultural view that sex was not just a private act, but a social transaction. In many ways, marriage today still carries a certain transactional nature, whether through financial agreements, expectations of loyalty, or the pressure to produce children and continue the family legacy. Another area where Roman sexuality has left a mark is in the enduring presence of sex work. In ancient Rome, prostitution was a legal profession, and sex workers were categorized into different classes, each with its own level of social acceptance. From the meretresses, who were registered prostitutes, to the slaves who were forced into sexual servitude, prostitution was an accepted part of Roman life. Although the specifics of sex work have evolved, the economic, social, and legal status of sex workers in modern times remains a complex and often contentious issue. In many societies, sex work is still criminalized, while in others, it is legalized and regulated. The Roman acceptance of sex work as part of daily life, with prostitutes often being integrated into the social fabric of Roman cities, mirrors the ongoing debates about the rights and treatment of sex workers in the present day. Roman sexual practices also played a significant role in the way they viewed public and private life. The public display of sexuality, from the festivals dedicated to fertility gods to the use of public bathhouses for sexual encounters, blurred the lines between the personal and the political. The concept of public morality, where the private lives of citizens were subject to public scrutiny, was deeply embedded in Roman culture. This is not so different from the way modern societies often intertwine public image with private behavior. In the age of social media, for example, the personal lives of public figures are scrutinized and dissected, and the boundaries between private and public life have never been more porous. The sexual codes of ancient Rome also had a profound impact on the way Roman art and literature evolved. Erotic imagery, from frescoes and mosaics to literary works, was not only accepted but celebrated in Roman culture. These depictions of sexuality were often intended to reinforce social hierarchies and expectations, offering visual representations of the power dynamics inherent in Roman relationships. Today, we still see the echoes of this artistic tradition in various forms of media, whether in the way modern advertising uses sex to sell products or how sexuality is portrayed in art and film. However, While Roman society may have celebrated sexual imagery, it also constructed a complex web of rules and restrictions around who could engage in sexual activity and under what circumstances. The Romans had specific roles for different groups within their society: slaves, foreigners, citizens, and these roles were reflected in their sexual practices. This system of sexual stratification was not just about personal preference. It was about maintaining order and control within the empire. The legacy of these strict sexual codes can still be seen in the way modern societies categorize people based on their gender, sexual orientation, and social status, with certain groups being more subject to regulation and control than others. The bizarre sexual practices of ancient Rome were not just eccentricities of a bygone era. They were deeply tied to the political, social, and economic structures that shaped Roman life. They reveal the complex ways in which power, pleasure, and control intersected in Roman society, and the ways in which these dynamics still resonate in the present day. From the regulation of sexual behavior to the commercialization of intimacy, the legacy of Roman sexuality continues to influence modern life in ways we may not even fully recognize. As we reflect on the intimate lives of the Romans, we are reminded that their practices, though seemingly strange or shocking to modern sensibilities, were rooted in the same human impulses that shape our own relationships today. The echoes of their sexuality, its complexities, contradictions, and power dynamics, still reverberate through the ages, serving as a reminder of the ways in which human nature, with all its desires, has always been shaped by the forces of politics, culture, and society. And as we stand in the ruins of their empire, we cannot help but wonder just how much our own society still reflects their legacy, and what it might say about us, as we continue to navigate the intersection of power, intimacy, and human connection.